On today's Prophecy in the News, we're going to discuss the United Nations Conference on Population Control held in Cairo, Egypt, September 5th through the 13th. Some 8,500 delegates from 182 nations attended. What is this population control they've been talking about? And why hold the meetings in Cairo, Egypt? When the conference on ecology was held last year, it was held in Rio de Janeiro, where the rainforest is located. When the population control conference was held, it was held in Cairo. Why? Because the first conference on population control held in human history was held in Pharaoh's court in Egypt. Gary Stearman is here to discuss with me this incredible conference on population.
Population control, or is there a hidden agenda? We'll be talking about that a little bit later on, but you mentioned the location. I think we should begin with the location. Cairo, Egypt.
Yes.
Cairo is a location that goes back literally, what, 4,000 or 5,000 years? The pyramids, in fact, may predate the flood, and in the shadow of these pyramids, we have this population conference being held, JR, and isn't it interesting that Egypt in the Bible, in the Old Testament, is specifically a type, and one of the clearest types we have in the Old Testament.
Yes.
Egypt is a type of the world, and the king of Egypt.
And the world is going to Egypt this month. Incredible, isn't it?
Yes, indeed. And the king of Egypt, of course, in the old time was called Pharaoh. Today, well, Egypt has something of a democracy, so-called, and we have Hosni Mubarak, but he's very much a modern-day Pharaoh presiding over these events that we see. And this really takes us back into biblical history, doesn't it?
Yes. Now, there are 182 different nations where this population conference could be held. Why Cairo? I believe the spirits that guided Pharaoh are guiding these people at the United Nations, which means to me that the United Nations is Luciferian to the core. I'll make no bones about it. Exodus chapter 1 tells us that in the days of the Jewish slaves, Pharaoh had a population control problem. I'll read in verse 9 of Exodus chapter 1. He, Pharaoh, said unto his people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it come to pass that when there falleth out any war, they join also unto our enemies and fight against us. And so Pharaoh had a population problem with the Jewish slaves. He did not want them to get out of control. And he said, there are more of them than there are of us. And that's a problem. That's the same basic problem being addressed in Cairo and by the United Nations. There are certain, shall we call them insiders, who want to establish a world government. But they want to be able to control the populations of the world. They don't want the population to get out of their control. Gary, I think this is a basic, fundamental reason why they met in Cairo.
Cairo, thematically, the headquarters of the world in the Old Testament, a type of the world. And of course, we have the stories of Israel traveling down to Egypt, coming back out of Egypt. We have even Jesus going down to Egypt, coming back out of Egypt. These are typological kinds of illustrations that the Bible uses of spiritual travail, shall we say. When you go down to Egypt, you're in trouble in the Bible. Right. and the world has gone down to Egypt, J.R. And interestingly, in the Old Testament, we have a situation in which Pharaoh wanted two things to happen to the Israelites. He wanted to control them, as you mentioned. I think he had extinction in mind, really, ultimately. He wanted to try to extinguish them, making his state really the very first anti-Semitic state.
Well, it was a Luciferian control here that wanted to thwart God's plan for the world. God had a plan through His chosen people, the Jews. Yeah. And that's this basic thing that has motivated Lucifer down through the centuries. The Holocaust in World War II was another attempt to eradicate God's chosen people, to thwart God's plan for mankind.
Now, the technique that Pharaoh planned, we have in Exodus 1:15 through 22. We won't read the whole thing, but you can read it for yourself. You can see how Pharaoh was practicing what today would be called abortion.
Yes.
I'm not sure that they had the ability to abort chemically or surgically as we do today in Egypt, but they did the next best thing. They caught women in the birthing process to destroy the sons, the firstborn sons of the house of Israel, and
throw them in the Nile.
And throw them in the Nile. So this is basically an abortion program, right?
Absolutely, the world's first abortion clinic. In fact, the scripture here says that the king built houses for the midwives. That is, he built abortion clinics for them. Isn't that incredible?
It is, it is.
And he charged that all of his people, saying, every son that is born ye shall cast into the river, and every daughter ye shall save alive. And it's interesting that Flavius Josephus wrote about this. He said that if any parent should disobey him and venture to save their male children alive, they and their families should be destroyed. This comes from the Antiquities of the Jews, Book 2, Chapter 9, Paragraph 2. He goes on to say that one of the magicians of Pharaoh's court had heard a prediction that was floating around among the Jews that a deliverer was about to be born, a Messiah of sorts. And Pharaoh wanted to abort the possible birth of this Messiah figure, which of course turned out to be Moses. And so the seed of the woman is the enemy of the seed of the serpent, and the serpent wants to get rid of the seed of the woman. This is a basic, fundamental, shall we say, battleground for Satan against God.
And you know, Moses was one of the Old Testament types of Messiah. He was deliverer. In fact, Moses was held the three offices of prophet, priest, and king, and then handed the priesthood off to Aaron.
Yes.
Where it went to the sons of Levi. And so really what you have in microcosm in the battle between Pharaoh and Moses is the same kind of a head-to-head conflict that you have between the world and Jesus. And JR, it's interesting to me that before Moses was born, there was this idea present that there was a deliverer coming.
Yes.
And Satan was trying to get rid of the deliverer. Fascinating.
When Jesus was born in the days of Herod the Great, Herod had this same phobia. And the spirits that guided Pharaoh evidently enticed Herod to have the male children in Bethlehem slaughtered, which probably included abortion. In the first century, abortion was possible. Flavius Josephus, the first century Jewish historian, writes concerning this, quote, "The law, moreover, enjoins us to bring up all our offspring, and forbids women to cause abortion of what is begotten, or to destroy it afterward," that is, after birth. "And if any woman appears to have done so, she will be a murderer of her child by destroying a living creature and diminishing humankind." This is in his treatise against Apion, Book 2, paragraph 25. 2,000 years ago, in the first century, a Jewish historian wrote that it was murder to abort a pre-born baby. Now, regardless of how people may feel about it today or what the Supreme Court has to say, it was even a part of the Hippocratic Oath until the 1970s that no doctor would induce abortion. And they took this oath, which they considered to be somewhat sacred.
That's true.
And today, that part of the Hippocratic Oath has been removed, which to me says it is no longer a Hippocratic Oath.
Physicians taking the Hippocratic Oath up through the late 60s and very early 70s still stated that under the oath that they took, that they would not induce abortion by giving any kind of an abortifacient or a medication, that they would not surgically induce abortion. And sometime in the early 70s, that little clause was taken out of the Hippocratic Oath as recited at medical schools in America. I don't know about other places in the world, but isn't it fascinating that the Greek physician Hippocrates, a pagan, by the way,
Yes.
who worshiped the god Aesculapius, the physician god of the Greeks, would take an oath and have others to take a binding oath saying they would never cause abortion. So we know that in the days preceding Josephus and right up to the first century, they knew of medications and techniques for terminating pregnancy, and yet they thought it was a horrendous thing. They equated it with murder.
Incredible, Gary. Absolutely incredible. And so in the days of the birth of Moses, abortion or killing babies was a method of ridding them of the possibility that a deliverer would be born. In the days of the birth of Jesus Christ, the same thing happened. But what about this century? Well, the Jews have been saying a Messiah is going to be born. For this reason, Lucifer, I think, and his evil spirits guided Adolf Hitler to try to exterminate the Jews from the planet. Now, we believe that Jesus Christ is the Messiah and that He is going to return. But the Jews do not understand this, do not accept this. They believe that a Messiah will be born. And so not only do we have this Luciferian control, this Nazism in World War II, killing the Jews, but we have, since then, a worldwide Luciferian attempt at trying to keep the Messiah from being born. That is probably the bottom line, don't you think, Gary?
Indeed. I think that is the bottom line. I think not only population control, but control of human behavior under the little rubric or title of what is called reproductive rights, rewarding any kind of sexual interaction that does not produce children. In other words, yes. if any kind of human behavior doesn't produce children, it's okay. If it does, it's automatically under question. And JR, once you have the global ability to control the outcome of reproduction, you can literally decide who has a baby and who does not, and it'll be okay because it's all under license and under law.
And basically it's slavery.
Basically slavery, and you know what's going to happen? The people who will be targeted for, I think the closest attention will be people who have traditionally been persecuted, and the top of that list is the Jews.
Also, Gary, I think it will be a racial thing. I think whoever makes the laws will consider that those who will be allowed to have children will be those who will have perfect children. And if a couple is going to have a baby and there's a possibility that they might have some kind of disease or some kind of genetic impurity, these impure children will be weeded out.
Of course. And who decides whether a child is perfect or not?
Yes.
And what's
the masters
exactly
will decide who among the slaves can have children and who cannot.
And really, this takes us back to Pharaoh. Master and slave.
Yes. It really does. And it brings us right down to the very crux of the matter. Even the Muslims are balking against the conference in Cairo. The conference is poison, coated with sugar, says one of the Egypt's fundamentalist groups entitled Clergyman Front. He says it claims to defend the family and individual rights, but twists this around to sanction unmarried couples, unwed mothers, and homosexual, lesbian liaisons as families. That's basically what this conference is all about. Of course, Al Gore, who headed up this delegation from the United States, says that this is not the case, but the 118-page draft that the United States delegation is promoting says it in black and white. So they can, you know, he can defend the moderation all he wants to, but the bottom line is money will be held from third world countries who do not follow the line. That's hardball tactics, Gary.
Absolutely. And interestingly, in third world countries, there are plants and agents present. I'm holding a paper here called Death March to Cairo. United Nations elites prepare for their global anti-life convention. Quoting a Dr. Fred Sai of Ghana, Dr. Sai caused some minor embarrassment, I'm quoting here, during the PrepCom, which was a preliminary talk before the conference held by delegates, when pro-life delegates distributed an article he had written equating unborn babies with parasites, end quote. Dr. Fred Sai, you've got to kind of let the cat out of the bag.
Yeah.
This is the thinking. An unborn baby, a parasite. In other words, something almost like a pest that we have to control in some way, because if we let these things get out of control, the world is doomed. And you know, JR, they're now saying we have 5 billion population plus, maybe 5.25 billion on Earth right now, and rapidly growing. The word is that population planners have said that planet Earth can sustain no more than about 7.5 billion comfortably. And that's where they've set their limit, 7.5 billion people. Well, that's not very far away before draconian measures would have to be engaged to hold the population at that level, 7.5 billion. The point that interests me in all this is that we've got humanists here who think there's no God, and that God, if he does exist, has gone away to some other universe. He's not watching. He's going to allow this kind of horror to befall planet Earth, where there will no longer be enough room for people to walk around. They'll be bumping into each other. There won't be food. But the Lord is on his throne. He hears, he sees, he watches.
Yes.
He's going to take care of us. I have no fear that this kind of a situation will ruin the earth, because our God's on the throne.
And it's interesting that Al Gore was chosen to head up this delegation. He's the prima donna of the ecologist movement. Save the snail darters, you know, save the whales,
The whales, yes.
but kill the babies. That's basically what they're saying. And it's also interesting to note that Bill Clinton appointed Jane Fonda as the Goodwill Ambassador to the Population Fund of the United Nations.
Wow.
She represents the United States. Here's one thing that she said. She said she accused Christians of being part of a, quote, powerful vested interests which want us to ignore contraception and safe abortion. She also said, quote, it is unconscionable that we aren't doing more to prevent unwanted children from being born. Hanoi Jane, and Bill Clinton, of course, who loves the military, he said so, though in 1969 he said he loathed the military and refused to go to Vietnam and fight. It's interesting that he would pick Hanoi Jane. To me, is his way of saying to all the Vietnam veterans, go fly a kite. And to send people like her and like the Bella Abzug and by the way, the people who headed up the United States delegation were head of Planned Parenthood in America, and most of the delegates there from many of the countries are heads of Planned Parenthood or abortion activists from other nations. They are there to, well, what some have called the Death March.
The Death March to Cairo. We have here the September 12th, 1994 Newsweek magazine. The article is called Population Wars, Body Politics. And JR, here's the way the editors of Newsweek are covered the conference. They say this week's global conference is officially about population, but it's become the battleground for a fierce culture clash. And they go on to say that the real hidden agenda in this thing is the empowerment of women. Virtually all of the subparagraphs, the articles of the conference position papers have some statement or another, JR, about educating women and giving women more equality, more of a voice in society, more education in order that they may control their own bodies, to use a phrase which has become very popular in America. In other words, the reproductive rights, or the responsibility for reproductive rights, has been given to the women in this conference. And some people have said, wait a minute, particularly in the third world, particularly in Muslim areas, wait a minute, we don't want you interfering in our culture. Our people are perfectly satisfied to run our culture the way we want to. So the conference is not without its detractors.
Not only are the Muslims upset about this idea of abortion, but the Vatican is upset, extremely upset about it. Gary, tell us about it.
Well, we have a sub part here, a little sidebar to the Newsweek article saying hot under the Roman collar. Quoting the Pope, as the Pope reads it, references to reproductive rights, pregnancy termination in the conference's draft document would establish abortion on demand as a UN-sanctioned human right. In his view, the draft also downplays marriage, ignores the roles of families, and tolerates adolescent sex. And, quote, I could go on quoting the Pope's opinions, but the Pope is staunchly opposed to the kind of, shall we say, reproductive rights teaching or philosophy that is espoused by those who pulled the conference together.
You know, it's interesting to me, Gary, that these people who believe in abortion and who are heading up the United States delegation to the Cairo conference are not the majority. But suppose they were. Suppose they were in the majority. It still does not make it right. It's kind of interesting that one of the speakers at this population conference was Pakistani leader Benazir Bhutto. And she spoke to the conference and she said, Pakistan will be guided in its policies by the laws of Islam, not by majority rule. Now, this is one reason why the Muslims were against it. Why is the Pope against it? Because the Bible is against it. Why should we be against it? Because the majority is against it? No. If we were the only one standing up against it, it should still be wrong because God is against it. Basically, that's what we need to understand. And Gary, this conference is anti-Christ, anti-God from the word go. And it's so sad, I think, that we should even see a conference like this being held. But we know it must be a sign of the times. For you see, they've gone back to their roots, to each